We had started on the lectures on sensory systems, and we defined a number of things that time. We defined sensations as being the awareness of a stimulus, which can be either internal or external stimulus. We also defined sensoreceptors as a modified neuron or epithelial cell that can transduce electrical signals, can detect stimuli, and they do that by transducing environmental energy into nerve impulses. We define sensory organ as the organ that houses the receptor. After we did that, we also then classified sensations, and we said that we have general sensations and special sensations. The special sensations that we mentioned include vision, olfaction, gustation, hearing, and equilibrium. The general sensations we mentioned include sensation of temperature, which is cold or heat, sensation of touch, sensation of pressure, that of vibration, that of proprioception, and we define proprioception as the sense of position, the sense of spatial orientation. The other general sensation is the sensation of pain, or you can call it noxious sensation. We had talked about how general sensations are relayed to the central nervous system, how the sensations travel to the central nervous system. We talked about that. We also started on how special sensations are taken to the brain, and the special sensations we did were two. We talked about sensation of smell and that of taste. So today we are going to handle three special sensations: the sensation of vision, that of hearing, and that of equilibrium. If you remember how sensations travel to the central nervous system, the model is that we have sensory receptors that detect environmental stimuli. These stimuli are in various forms of energy. Could be chemical energy, could be physical energy, or other mechanical energy. Could be light energy, whatever form of energy that the environmental stimuli is, the sensory receptors must be able to convert those kind of physical energies into nerve impulses. And once they have converted them into nerve impulses, those impulses are relayed to the cerebral cortex via the afferent nerve systems, or what we call the ascending pathways or sensory systems. They're the ones that relay the information from the receptors to the cerebral cortex. Well, the sensations can go to many other places, including the cerebral cortex. I'm particularly mentioning cerebral cortex because that is where interpretation of the sensations will take place. Right. We mentioned that for sensations to come from the sensory receptors, the cerebral cortex, it is not a journey of one single neuron. As a matter of fact, it's a journey of three neurons in series. The first neuron takes that information from the sensory receptor to the spinal cord or brainstem, and that neuron is the one we call the primary or the first order sensory neuron. The first order sensory neuron will then tend to have its cell body outside the central nervous system. The cell bodies of the first order sensory neurons are the ones that will then constitute the sensory ganglia. The first order neuron terminate at the spinal cord or brainstem in specific sites. When they terminate, they actually synapse with second order sensory neurons. The second order sensory neurons do two things. One is that the second order neuron, once it has been formed, it immediately decassettes. To decassette is to cross over from right to left or from left to right. So if the first order sensory neuron ended at the spinal cord, it means that the second order sensory neuron will begin from the spinal cord. If this first neuron ended at the brainstem, it means the second order neuron will begin at the brainstem. But the first thing it does is to decassette. The second thing second order sensory neuron does is to terminate in the thalamus. So after terminating the thalamus, it will synapse with a third order sensory neuron, which we now call the tertiary sensory neuron. The tertiary sensory neuron is the one that comes from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So that's what we call thalamocortical radiation. These are examples of projection fibers coming from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. At the cerebral cortex, the sensation is interpreted. So this is the general outline of how sensations go from the periphery to the cerebral cortex for perception. So with that understanding, therefore, I want us to look at the sensations of hearing and those of equilibrium. We'll look at their general anatomy together because they are housed within the same organ. The receptors that detect hearing, as well as those that detect equilibrium, are located within the ear. Specifically, these receptors are housed within the petrous part of the temporal bone. The temporal bone being one of the bones of the skull base, as well as neurocranium, as well as the membranous neurocranium. There is a part of the temporal bone that is within the calvaria, and that the squamous part of the temporal bone, which is this one. But there's a part, actually several parts of the temporal bone, which are on the skull base. And the petrous bone, the petrous part of the temporal bone, is just one of those parts of the temporal bone which are on the skull base. This particular part, the petrous part of the temporal bone, is the one that houses the receptors for hearing and those for equilibrium. So basically it houses the ear, what we call the ear. Now, from anatomical point, the ear has three parts. You have the outer ear, middle ear, and the inner ear. And I want us to look at the anatomy of the ear in a greater detail than that. Perhaps before we look at the anatomy of the ear in detail, just something you did, I don't know whether it was high school or primary school, but there was this question here of the key function of the outer ear. I'd want you to answer that in the poll. Let me enable it for you. Just a second. Okay, I've now enabled it. I'm giving you 1 minute. Answer it in the poll. This was the second question, which it wasn't well answered. Let's see. So we've said that the ear has three parts. We'll start with the outer ear. This is the outer ear. The outer ear consists of the pin of the ear, which is this one here, as well as the external auditory meatus. This is the external auditory meatus. The external auditory meatus is also called the auditory canal. Don't confuse auditory canal with auditory tube, which is this other one. So this is called auditory canal, and this is called the pin of the ear. The auditory canal is the external auditory meatus. The purpose of these two is to collect sound waves. So, in some other animals, they're even able to manipulate the position of the pinna to be able to collect the sound waves from a particular direction. In humans, we really don't do that, but at least we're able to turn our neck easily to position our ear. Once the outer ear has collected the sound waves converge to this one here, which we call the eardrum. Usually the eardrum would be discussed under the middle ear actually. But of course, as we can see, it's a junction between the outer ear and the middle ear. The key role of the eardrum is to transduce the sound waves from sound energy to vibration energy. So it changes the sound waves. As sound waves come, the eardrum vibrates so that the sound wave is changed to vibration energy. And that's the role of the eardrum. So that now what we have right now is no longer sound wave, but vibration. So we can now then talk about the middle ear. The middle ear, which is this region, is also known as the tympanic cavity. The tympanic cavity contains ear ossicles. Ear ossicles are some small bones within the middle ear. These are the small bones. We have what we call malleus. We have what we call incus. And we have what we call steps. And they're in that order. That's the ossicular chain. So vibration passed through from the eardrum, vibration passed through the malleus. Then, as you can see, we have an articulation between malleus and incus. There's a joint there. Then from incus, there's also an articulation with the steps. So that is the incudo-stapedial joint. And that's the incudo-malleolar joints. So anyway, you don't have to know the names of the joints. The point here is that vibration passed through malleus, then incus, then steps. That's the ossicular chain. What's the purpose of these bones? Basically, as vibration passes through the ossicular chain amplifies the vibrations. So the purpose of the ossicular chain is to amplify the vibrations. As we can see also, the middle ear is connected to the pharynx through what we are calling the eustachian tube. The eustachian tube is also called the auditory tube. The pharynx is the throat. Your throat is what we are calling the pharynx. Usually the throat has multiple parts. We have nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. We are not discussing that today, but the specific part of the throat where the auditory tube opens is the nasopharynx. This is the upper part of the pharynx, the upper part of the throat, that space that is behind the nose. So this tube here, which we are calling auditory tube or eustachian tube, and I reminded you not to confuse auditory tube with auditory canal. The purpose of this tube is to balance pressure between the pressure in the pharynx and the pressure in the middle ear. It needs to equalize that pressure. Now, why is it important to equalize pressure in the pharynx with that in the middle ear? Remember, the pressure in the pharynx is basically the same as atmospheric pressure. You open your mouth and we breathe normally. So the pressure in the pharynx is the same as atmospheric pressure, which means it's the same as the pressure here in the outer ear. So basically what this tube does is to balance the pressure in the middle ear with the pressure in the outer ear. And it is important for that pressure to be balanced so that the eardrum can have normal tension. You can imagine if the pressure within the outer ear was much higher than the pressure in the middle ear, this eardrum would bulge inwards that way. As it happens, sometimes when we are traveling from a high altitude zone to a low altitude zone, you feel like your eardrum, okay, you may not feel in the eardrum, but you feel like you lose hearing. We lose hearing because the eardrum becomes so tense because it is now curved. And so it reduces its threshold for detecting sound nicely. It reduces the threshold, the efficiency of how it converts sound to vibration. The same thing if you're traveling from a low altitude zone to a high altitude zone. And so it means that the pressure in the middle ear goes, okay, the pressure in the outer ear goes lower than the pressure in the inner ear. The eardrum will bulge outwards. The point here is that any pressure difference between the outer ear and the middle ear will make the eardrum to bulge in a particular direction. And the bulging of the eardrum will make it a bit tense and so less efficient for transduction of sound energy. So that's why we have the eustachian tube to be able to balance that pressure. So whether the pressure here is low, it's fine. We also make the pressure there low so that the eardrum is balanced. If the pressure here is high, also make the pressure there high so that the eardrum is balanced. And that's why when you're traveling and you start losing your hearing, if you swallow saliva or you yawn, well, if you are rich, then maybe you have some sweets, your eardrum goes back to normal and your hearing comes normal. But if you don't do any of those, then you'll feel like you're losing your hearing. So the purpose of the middle ear is to amplify vibrations, but also to equalize pressure. Now we talk about the inner ear. The inner ear is this region here. The inner ear contains some channels. These channels are known as labyrinths. The channels which are formed by bone are known as bony labyrinth. And the channels which are formed by membranes are known as membranous labyrinth. So we have two types of channels, the bony labyrinth and the membranous labyrinth. The labyrinth are channels or cavities. Now, so the bony labyrinth here refers to channels or cavities within the petrous bone. There are three types of bony labyrinth. This is what we call the vestibule, which is this region. This is what we call the cochlea, which is this one turning on itself like the shell of a snail. And this is what we call the semicircular canals, which are these ones. The semicircular canals are three. So I want you to understand it this way. Bony labyrinth refer to cavities within petrous bone. We have three types of cavities, three types of channels: the vestibule, the cochlea, and semicircular canal. I want you to imagine the bony labyrinth as a biro pen. Now, that glass outer thing is the bone. So the inside of that glass outer thing is what we are calling the bony labyrinth. It's a channel within bone. Then now, within that bony labyrinth, there are membranes which also form channels. And that is what will constitute the membranous labyrinth. I want you to understand, therefore, that membranous labyrinth is like the tube of that biro pen, the one that contains ink. You realize that the tube will be containing ink, and the tube goes inside the outer glassy kind of container, that glassy tube which is outside. The inside of that glassy tube is what we call the bony labyrinth. But now the tube of the biro pen that enters that bony labyrinth in quote is what we are calling the membranous labyrinth. And also, still based on that example, the fluid inside the tube that contain ink, okay, the tube inside the membranous labyrinth, that cavity within the membranous labyrinth contain a different kind of fluid. And I'll be giving you the names of the fluid shortly, but contain a different type of fluid from the fluid that is contained within the bony labyrinth. So what are the components of the membranous labyrinth? We have what we call utricle and circle. The utricle and the circle are components of membranous labyrinth that are located within the vestibule. So this is the circle. This is the utricle. This region here is the one representing the vestibule. So utricle and circle are components of the membranous labyrinth, which are housed within the vestibule. Remember, vestibule is a bony labyrinth. These two function as reservoirs of fluid. The fluid within the membranous labyrinth is called endolymph. So these two serve as reservoirs for endolymph. The endolymph within the circle, which is this one, is continuous with the membranous labyrinth that runs within the cochlea. The membranous labyrinth that runs within the cochlea is known as the cochlear duct. So the cochlear duct is also a component of the membranous labyrinth, and it refers to the membranous labyrinth within the cochlea itself. This cochlear duct therefore contains endolymph as well, and that endolymph is the one that is coming from the circle. The circle functions as a reservoir for the endolymph within the cochlear duct. In the same manner of concept, we have what we call semicircular ducts. So semicircular ducts are membranous labyrinths within the semicircular canals. But these semicircular ducts have their fluid being reserved within the utricle. So the utricle functions as a reservoir of fluid within the semicircular ducts. Great. These are the components of the membranous labyrinth. Having talked about the anatomy of the ear, telling you about outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear, let's now talk about the sensation of hearing. So this is how hearing occurs. First, there will be sound waves in the environment, and those sound waves travel, they'll be collected by the outer ear. After the outer ear has collected the sound waves, the outer ear will converge the sound waves to the eardrum, which we are calling the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane responds by creating vibrations. The vibrations which have been created by the tympanic membrane then travel through the ossicular chain, malleus, incus, and steps in that order. During that journey of traveling of the vibrations, there will be some level of amplification so that you enhance the vibration basically. Now we see here that the bone called steps has an articulation with a region that connects to the inner ear. That region there is called the oval window. So the vibrations of the steps are taken to the oval window. And from now the oval window, we are now talking about the inner ear. Now look at the inner ear. Specifically, that vibration is taken to the cochlea. So the cochlea is in the inner ear. Now, if you imagine the concept of the biro pen with the tube inside, let's imagine that before you insert that tube into before you insert the tube with ink into the glassy tube, let's imagine that the glassy tube has some water inside it. Then now you insert the tube with ink, full of ink, into the glassy tube. You'll still have your ink in its normal tube, but you'll have some water outside the tube with ink. That water, even though it's inside the pen, it is outside the tube with ink. And the same concept here. There is some fluid that is outside the cochlear duct. The fluid that's outside the cochlear duct is called perilymph, in contrast with the fluid within the cochlear duct that we call endolymph. So we have endolymph and perilymph. The oval window is connected to the perilymph. But it is through these vibrations in the perilymph that vibration will now be translated to the cochlear duct. So we see here, the perilymph is vibrating, following the vibrations within the ossicular chain. There are vibrations in the perilymph here, and those vibrations are taken to the endolymph through this membrane. So there are vibrations in the perilymph, which then translate to the endolymph here. Now, this is the cross-section of the cochlea with the bone seen there and the membrane here. This one here is the cochlear duct. And so when you take that cross-section, you see three cavities. They have different names, and I don't want to go into those. But remember, the one that we are calling the cochlear duct, this one, is the one with endolymph. The others contain perilymph. Now, the reason why you're seeing three cavities is because even though we are saying it is membranous labyrinth, the membrane is not really loose from the wall of the bone on all ends. Some are attached on two sides, and then on two sides not attached. So that's why you have three cavities. My interest is within the cochlear duct itself. Within the cochlear duct, there's some special cells within the cochlear duct. These special cells are called hair cells, and they are located within a very delicate structure here, which we call the spiral organ of Corti. This spiral organ of Corti is the receptor for hearing. So when vibrations from the oval window are translated into the perilymph, the vibration, the perilymph, are then translated to the cochlear duct. The contents of the cochlear duct will experience that vibration, and these vibrations are detected by the hair cells within the spiral organ of Corti. The spiral organ of Corti is the receptor for hearing. The spiral organ of Corti is located within the cochlear duct. And remember, cochlear duct is located within the cochlea. The cochlea is located within the inner ear. So once the hair cells have been activated, they'll convert that signal to nerve impulses. And these nerve impulses are then relayed through the 8th cranial nerve, specifically the cochlear division. And that is how hearing will then be relayed to the brain. So from the cochlear nerve, that information goes to the brainstem. Remember, cochlear nerve, therefore, in this case, constitute the first order sensory neuron. it will terminate in the brainstem by synapsing the second-order sensory neuron. Now, for cochlea, there'll also be some reflexes anywhere at the brainstem, specifically at the level of the midbrain. There's a region we called earlier the inferior colliculi. If you remember that part, it was within the midbrain. Anyway, you may have forgotten, not a big deal. The point here is that if you want information regarding hearing to go to the brain, well, there are some that will go to the cerebral cortex, but there are some that will remain the brainstem to mediate reflexes. This is why when you hear a loud bang, you'll turn your neck immediately towards the direction of sound. That's an auditory reflex. But let's not follow the reflex, let's follow the journey to perception of hearing. So the journey to perception of hearing will then now mean that from the first order sensory neurons here, you form second order sensory neurons, which will then decassette and travel all the way to the thalamus. And from the thalamus, you have the third order sensory neurons, which take that information to the primary auditory cortex. The primary auditory cortex is located in the transverse temporal gyri. Within the temporal lobe, we called it area number 41 and area number 42. That is where hearing sensation is perceived. So that's hearing. How about equilibrium? The information regarding equilibrium is detected by vestibular apparatus. What are we calling vestibular apparatus? Vestibular apparatus refer to these ones here: the utricle, the circle. Now remember, those ones are within the vestibule. The other component of the vestibular apparatus are the semicircular ducts. Semicircular ducts are within the semicircular canals. So those three types of structures are the ones you're calling vestibular apparatus: the utricle, the circle, and the semicircular ducts. These vestibular apparatus are sensitive to change in head position. Particularly, the utricle and circle are sensitive for linear acceleration, while the semicircular ducts are sensitive to rotational acceleration. When I talk of linear acceleration, I mean if you're moving on a straight line, let's say you are moving forward, you are running forward or walking forward, that is in the same horizontal plane. That is linear acceleration. But also, if you're moving up, down, without curving, that is still linear acceleration. So one of these will detect the vertical linear acceleration and another one detect the horizontal linear acceleration. I want you to go check which one detects vertical linear acceleration and which one detects horizontal linear acceleration. The semicircular ducts are sensitive to rotational acceleration, which means when you turn your head in a rotatory manner, then these are the ones that detect that information. We have a posterior semicircular canal, a lateral semicircular canal, and the anterior semicircular canal. Those semicircular canals are positioned at 90 degrees to each other. So they're in orthogonal planes, basically being able to then detect rotational acceleration in any plane because it is already 3D. Information regarding equilibrium is relayed to the brain via the vestibular nerve. The vestibular nerve is part of the 8th cranial nerve as well. So vestibular function goes to many parts of the brain, very many parts of the brain. But the one that is for perception will be directed to the vestibular area, which is within the parietal cortex. But there are many other projections for vestibular function. Now, the point here is that information regarding head position is relayed to many other parts of the brain so that we achieve balance of the head, not necessarily fully out of your conscious decision. You know, you don't have to struggle saying, I now need to put my head straight on my cervical spine. You don't have to be thinking actively about that. And the reason why we don't have to be thinking actively about that is because there are many projections regarding vestibular function to other parts of the brain, cerebellum, even spinal cord. And importantly also, there is connection between information regarding head position and the position of your eyes. Tells you why you're able to move your eyes several times, even without necessarily then changing the position of your head, or you can change your position of your head several times without really changing what your eyes are fixed to. This is because there is kind of harmony between the position of the head and eye movements. And that is only made possible by the center that controls eye movement receiving information regarding head position. And that's why you see those many other projections from the vestibular area. Great. So this is the sensation of equilibrium. And so that summarizes the story about the anatomy of the ear. I'll give you a short break. When we come back, we'll then now look at the sensation of vision. We can resume now. We're now going to talk about the sensation of vision. This is the last special sensation that we are looking at. First, let's agree on some parts of the eye as seen and face, like what we're doing right now. So these are things you know. That's what we call the upper eyelid. And of course, those are the eyelashes. So the one below is what we call the lower eyelid. The medical name for the eyelids are palpebra. Palpebra. So the superior palpebra and the inferior palpebra. The gap between the eyelids is therefore called the palpebral fissure. This gap between the two eyelids is what we are calling the palpebral fissure, which means that if your eyes are open, then it means that your palpebral fissure is wide. And if you close your eyes, then it means you've narrowed or you've obliterated the palpebral fissure. This region where the two eyelids meet medially is what we call the medial canthus, and therefore the other one will be called the lateral canthus. The white of the eye is what we call the sclera. This diaphragm-like thing with the hole at the center, this is what we call the iris. And the hole at the center is what we call the pupil. There's this shiny thing in front of those two. The shiny thing, it is transparent, so you can't really see it, but it's there. The transparent thing is what is known as the cornea. There's also a membrane that's also transparent that is lining the sclera, which we call the conjunctiva. From a lateral view, or rather from a sagittal view, perhaps we understand more about the anatomy of the eye. And if you're asked to use a label diagram to illustrate the anatomy of the eye, this is what we'd want you to illustrate: a sagittal anatomy of the eye. From a sagittal perspective, we can describe the eye as being formed by three layers: the outer layer, the middle layer, and the inner layer. The outer layer of the eye is known as the fibrous layer. You can call it fibrous coat. Some people call it in Latin the tunica fibrosa. The tunica fibrosa consists of the cornea, which is in front. This is the cornea. The cornea being a smaller proportion of the tunica fibrosa. The largest portion of the tunica fibrosa is made up of the sclera. This is the sclera. The cornea is transparent. It allows light to pass through. It is also highly innervated. It has several sensory nerve terminals that mediate the corneal reflex, and also just for protecting the eye, basically. So the cornea will be part of the refractive media of the eye because that's where light passes through. On the other hand, the sclera forms the site of attachment of the muscles that move the eye. The muscles that move the eye insert onto the sclera. The sclera is white. It is not transparent, it is white. Collectively, the fibrous coat is therefore known as the corneoscleral layer because it's made up of the cornea and the sclera. The junction between the cornea and the sclera around this point is what we call the limbus. So that is limbus, and this is also limbus. The limbus will be very near that region where we have the ciliary body and the iris. Being a fibrous layer, the overall function of the fibrous coat, the overall function of the corneoscleral layer is to offer protection to the eye. The second layer of the eye is known as the uvea. Some people may call it the vascular coat because it is highly vascularized. Or in Latin, we call it the tunica vascularis. This tunica vascularis is also called in English the uvea or the uveal tract. The red one represents the uvea. You realize that the outer one, the cornea and the sclera. So the red one is the uvea. What are the components of the uvea? The uvea consists of the choroid. The choroid is this posterior part, the red one in the middle there. That is the choroid. The choroid is heavily pigmented, so it's dark actually in histological sections, very dark. Well, the whole of the uvea is actually heavily pigmented. And so choroid is not an exception. That is largely to absorb light. Apart from the fact that the choroid is dark to absorb light, the choroid is also heavily vascularized. And it is from this vascularity that the uvea gets its name. The vascularity of the choroid is to provide nutrition to the retina. So basically, the choroid provides nutrition to the retina. The second component of the uvea is the ciliary body. This is the ciliary body here. Two key functions for the ciliary body. One is that it suspends the lens. So this is the lens. The ciliary body suspends the lens through these suspensory ligaments. And so through that, the ciliary body is able to adjust the shape of the lens. Adjusting the shape of the lens is important for focusing. If you want to see far objects, then the lens must flatten. If you want to see near objects, then the lens bulges in what we call accommodation. Apart from suspending and adjusting the shape of the lens, the ciliary body also secretes the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor is the fluid here. The fluid inside here is what we call the aqueous humor, the fluid within here. That fluid is secreted by the ciliary body and it enters through here, then flow through the pupil and come here to be absorbed somewhere here and goes away through the region of the limbus. So two functions of the ciliary body: to suspend and adjust the lens, and two, to secrete the aqueous humor. The third component of the uvea is the iris. This is the iris. Basically, the iris controls the size of the pupil. That means that it has some muscles within it, which are smooth muscles. And these smooth muscles can contract in such a way that the pupil becomes smaller or it becomes dilated. For that to happen, it means that the iris must have those smooth muscles in different orientations. And these are the orientations. So this is the iris, but if you look at it from end face, then this is what you see. Closer to the pupil, we have a circular muscle. And away from the pupil, we have a radial organization of the muscles. The inner circular muscle, when it contracts, it will make the pupil become smaller. And so we call the inner circular muscle the constrictor pupillae muscle. Similarly, the outer radial muscle, when they contract, they'll make the pupil become wider. And so we call the radial muscle the dilator pupillae muscle. Before we proceed, I'll ask you a question. And this is the question with regard to innervation of the eye. We've done this before. And so I expect you to know the answer. I'll give it to you in the poll. That's the question. So there are two questions there. You have 1 minute. It's a simple question. Okay, so let's see how you performed. So majority of you have done horribly on the first question, as well as on the second question. I don't know why. Remember we mentioned that the iris contains smooth muscles. So first of all, the innervation here must be autonomic. It can either be sympathetic or parasympathetic. I am surprised that majority of you are picking the first one. Yet when we discuss cranial nerves, we mentioned that optic nerve is purely sensory. To innervate a muscle is a motor function, not a sensory function. Anyway, we also talked about the fact that there's some cranial nerves with parasympathetic function. Sympathetic nerves come from the spinal cord exclusively. The inner circular muscle makes the pupil to constrict. Pupillary constriction is a parasympathetic function. And parasympathetic innervation to the eye is by the oculomotor nerve. On the other hand, the outer radial muscle causes pupillary dilatation, and that is a sympathetic function. Let's talk about the third layer of the eye. The third layer of the eye is called the retina, or the retinal layer. The retinal layer contains photoreceptor cells, and therefore the retina becomes the receptor for light. It is continuous posteriorly, not necessarily directly posterior, as we can see in this drawing, but either way it's posterior. On the posterior part of the globe is the eye. The retina is continuous with the optic nerve. This region where the retina is continuous with the optic nerve will not necessarily have the photoreceptor cells. And therefore, light rays that land on this region cannot be detected because there are no photoreceptor cells here. It therefore constitutes the blind spot of the eye. The optic disc is a blind spot. It means that the light rays that land there cannot necessarily be detected because that region does not have photoreceptor cells. On the other hand, there is a region of small depression within the retina. That region of small depression within the retina is called the fovea. It coincides with the central part of the eye, actually. This drawing does not capture it nicely. Maybe it could have been drawn somewhere here, so that the central ray of the eye lands around or approximately at the fovea. The region around the fovea contain the highest concentration of the photoreceptor cells. That region that contains the highest concentration of the photoreceptor cells is what we call the macula. So remember, the fovea is there, yes. The region around the fovea contains the highest concentration of the photoreceptor cells, and so we call the macula. The macula is the region of the highest visual acuity. It represents information from the central part of the visual field. The rays that come from the central part of the visual field land on the macular region of the retina. And that's why when you want to see something clearly, then you fix it in the center of the visual field. Then you see it nicely, as opposed to looking at it from the side. Histologically, the retina looks like this, a very magnificent structure. The cells of the retina are organized in multiple layers. From here to there is the retina. This other region here is the choroid with vascular spaces. I told you it's heavily vascularized. This other one is the sclera, which is fibrous, basically. So the retina is attached to the choroid, and that is why the choroid, therefore, was the one that provided nutrition to it. There are several cells within the retina which are organized in layers, and those layers then appear like this one. Those layers are numbered, but I don't want us to go into that concept. But it's important to know that there are a number of cell types of the retina. There are those cells which function as photoreceptors. There are those cells that function as conduction cells, and I'll be explaining what that is. There are those cells which we call association cells, and there are those that we call supporting cells. These are the classes of cells of the retina. So perhaps I use this to then now tell you those categories of cells. The photoreceptor cells of the retina are the cells that detect light. So these cells are two. We have the rods and the cones. Rods and cones are the photoreceptor cells of the retina. They detect light. The second category of the retinal cell types, as I mentioned, are the conduction cells of the retina. Conduction cells are part of the sensory relay pathway. The cells of the sensory relay pathway. There are also two. We have the bipolar neurons of the retina. The bipolar neurons of the retina are the first order sensory neurons in the pathway of vision. First order sensory neurons in the pathway of vision, bipolar neurons. Then we have the ganglion cells. Ganglion cells are the second order sensory neurons in the pathway of vision. Now, it is important for you to note that the axons of the ganglion cells are the ones that merge to constitute the optic nerve. Therefore, optic nerve is not a first order, it's not a bundle of first order sensory neurons. It's actually a bundle of second-order sensory neurons. That's very unique to visual pathway. It's a bundle of second-order sensory neurons as opposed to first-order sensory neurons. The third category of the cells of the retina are the association cells. Association cells are neurons still. They are neurons within the retina which connect different bipolar neurons. So they associate. If you remember the concept of association, even in the cerebral cortex, a neuron that joins different regions within the same side. So we are bringing that concept here. We have two types of association cells, the horizontal cells and the amacrine cells. Those are association cells. Lastly, we have the supporting cells of the retina. So supporting cells of the retina provide structural support. They hold neurons. They anchor the cells. And the key cell here is the Muller cell. Muller is written as M-U-L-L-A-R. The Muller cells of the retina function like astrocytes in the central nervous system. So they provide structural support among other functions that they're also able to perform. The other cell you can add within the retina are the pigment cells of the retina. The pigment cells of the retina represent, they're just epithelial cells which are heavily pigmented. And among the important functions is to form the blood-retinal barrier. Pigment cells of the retina form the blood-retinal barrier. There's a barrier between blood and retina. You don't want blood to go direct to the retina. You only want nutrients without blood cells to go to the retina. And the reason why you don't want blood cells to be in the retina is because they're likely to cause opacities within the retina, and that will impair passage of light to the retina. It will impair vision. So there must be a blood-retinal barrier, partly offered by the pigment cells of the retina. Well, they're also pigmented to absorb light so that there are no internal reflections within the retina or internal reflections within the eye. That's the whole purpose of different parts of the eye being heavily pigmented, so that light rays cannot be reflected within the globe. Because if you have multiple reflections, you're going to have multiple images. You know, if you go to a kinyozi, well, not all of you do that, but maybe salon also has it. And the kinyozi has multiple mirrors on the wall. At some point, you see your images in almost all of them, and you wonder, Kwani, how many are you came? It's because of multiple reflections. So you don't want those multiple images to form, because now the brain will be wondering, how many people am I seeing? And it blurs the images if you have the reflections. So the pigmentation prevents that from happening. So I've taken you through the three parts of the layers of the eye. Let's talk about segments of the eye. The eye can be described to have anterior and posterior segments. The junction between the anterior and the posterior segment is this axis of the lens. Anything in front of the lens is in the anterior segment, and behind the lens is in the posterior segment. So if you talk about the anterior segment, we are referring to this region that contains the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor is in the anterior segment of the eye. Now, the chamber that contains the aqueous humor is also divided, the region that contains the aqueous humor, which means the anterior segment, is also divided into chambers. We have an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber. This categorization is based on the location of the iris. The region of the anterior chamber behind the iris is termed the posterior segment. The region of the aqueous humor in front of the iris is termed the anterior chamber. So let me say that again. I have a feeling I said something wrong. The region of the aqueous humor behind the iris is the posterior segment. The region of the aqueous humor in front of the iris is the anterior chamber. So you have posterior chamber and anterior chamber. The communication between the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber is the pupil. So when aqueous humor is secreted by the ciliary body here, it will go through the posterior chamber, then go through the pupil, then flow like this to the anterior chamber, then become absorbed somewhere here within some canals which are found within the limbus. The posterior segment largely contains the vitreous humor. This is the posterior segment. This is the optic disc, which is the blind spot. Okay, now we can talk about the refractive media of the eye. The refractive media of the eye refer to the structures through which light passes. So light that enters the eye will first pass through the cornea, definitely. So the cornea is part of the refractive media. A lot of bending of light occurs at the cornea. The cornea is the strongest refractive media. Even though it's the strongest refractive media, it is not adjustable. You can't adjust the location of, or rather the curvature of the cornea. So it's a fixed but strong refractive media. After the cornea, now before that, the concept about refraction is usually about when light passes from one media to another. Now the difference those media is what will make the structure be strongly refractive or not. So here, light is passing from air to a solid thing. So there's a lot of refraction there, as opposed to solid to liquid. There's less refraction here. So from the cornea, the second component of the refractive media is this one, which we call the aqueous humor. Then the lens. Then finally, the vitreous humor. So those four constitute the refractive media of the eye. In that order, these are the structures that light will pass through. As light passes through them, they'll bend light. You'll realize that out of all of them, only this one is adjustable. You can only adjust the lens. And even if you adjust the lens, it is not conscious. It is autonomic. When the lens bulges, you see objects which are near. That's what we call accommodation. Now that is more of a parasympathetic tone. When the lens flattens, it makes you see far objects, and that is more sympathetic drive. This again shows you the refractive media of the eye. So you'll have to go through cornea, then aqueous humor, lens, then vitreous humor. All right, I want to, okay, maybe you can do this. We still have some time before I give you the second break. Let's talk about visual pathway. Before we talk about visual pathway, there's some things that would be good to explain first. So the region that your eyes can see is what we call the visual field. So the region on the left will be called the left visual field. The region on the right will be called the right visual field. The region your eyes can see, that geographical map that your eyes are able to see. Like right now, most likely, if you're using your phone or your computer is within your visual field. If you're looking at a wall, that wall is within your visual field. If you're looking at some food on the table, that food on the table is within your visual field. So whatever you're seeing is within your visual field. So the objects which are on the left are in the left visual field, the objects which are on the right visual field. So let's put our eyes here. Left eye, right eye. Let's just pick one eye and see how rays enter the eye. Remember, posteriorly, we have retina, which receive the light rays. The retina can be divided into two in this case. There's the part of the retina that is medial. There's the part of the retina that's lateral. So the medial retina, for each eye, there'll be a medial retina and a lateral retina. The medial retina is the side of the retina near the nose. So we can just call it the nasal retina. The lateral aspects of the retina are the parts of the retina on the side of the temporal bones. So we call them temporal retina. With regard to the eye, nasal means medial and temporal means lateral. So light rays will go through the pupil somewhere there. Okay, now follow with me. Let's follow the left eye. Rays, light rays, which come from the right visual field will travel like this, and we can follow this line. Will travel like that up to the retina on the left eye. Rays which come from the left visual field, and we can follow this ray, will travel like that through the pupil to the retina there in the left eye. There's something I want you to notice. You see this ray which comes from the left visual field, we can say it's coming from the temporal aspect of the visual field. If we are looking at it with respect to this eye, with respect to this left eye, this ray, which is coming from the left part of the visual field, is coming from the temporal aspect of the visual field, not temporal aspect of the retina, but temporal aspect of the visual field. So we can call it temporal ray. A temporal ray lands on which retina? It lands on a nasal retina. And a nasal ray lands on a temporal retina. I want you to capture that. And even if you use this eye, that still remains the same. This is temporal ray for this eye. A temporal ray lands on a nasal retina. And a nasal ray, this one, lands on a temporal retina. That's the first concept I want you to get. A temporal ray lands on a nasal retina. A nasal ray lands on a temporal retina. At the eye, there is some inversion because the light rays change direct at the pupil. I also want you to see this part here. Maybe if I had labeled it, it could have been better. But I want you to look at the location of the pointer. You see this V-shaped region is what the left eye can see. The region I'm outlining is what the left eye can see. Now let me outline the region where the right eye can see. This region is what the right eye can see. Now what do you notice? You notice that there are some regions that only one eye can see, and there are some regions where both eyes can see. Now this region where both eyes can see, this region where both eyes can see is called the binocular visual field, where the pointer is. We call that the binocular visual field, the region where both eyes can see. So the others are not binocular visual field, but I want you to know that this region here is called the binocular visual field. Now let's follow the light rays. They have entered, they have landed on the retina. So the retina detects the light rays, convert it to action potentials picked by the bipolar neurons, which are the first order sensory neurons, but still within the retina, the bipolar neurons synapse with the ganglion cells, which are the second order sensory neurons. Those second order sensory neurons then come out of the retina as optic nerve. Now see how the fibers of optic nerve are arranged. The axons which come from the temporal retina are lateral, as we can see them here. The axons which come from the nasal retina are medial. Similarly, even from this eye, the axons which come from the medial retina or from the nasal retina are medial, and the axons which come from the lateral retina, the temporal retina, are lateral here. And that shouldn't be a big deal to understand. As the two optic nerves approach each other towards the brain, now they've come just from the orbit. The apex of the orbit is somewhere here. This is where we have the optic canal somewhere around here. So beyond there, this was the orbit, then now the cranial cavity. As the optic nerves enter the cranial cavity, some of the optic nerve fibers decassette. Remember, optic nerve are second order sensory neurons, and second order sensory neurons decassette. So some of the optic nerve fibers decassette. The point of the decassation is what we are calling the optic chiasm. I want us to pause here and think through deeply after I'll have told you how the fibers decassette. I've told you that not all the fibers decassette. Now, from these images, we can see which fibers do not decassette. The optic nerve fibers from the lateral, from the temporal retina, those ones don't decassette. They go on the same side. But the optic nerve fibers from the nasal retina decassette. So the one from the left goes to the right, and the one from the right goes to the left. Why should these fibers not all decassette? Yet usually we expect that the right side of the brain control the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain control the right side of the body. This is the reason. If you follow the fibers which are decassetting, you'll notice that these fibers which are decassetting are coming from the nasal retina. But which information is on the nasal retina? The information on the nasal retina is the information from the temporal visual field. If you follow this one, temporal visual field goes to nasal retina, then now from nasal retina, we have fibers going decassetting somewhere, as opposed to fibers which come from the nasal visual field. Don't confuse nasal visual field with nasal retina. Fibers which come from the nasal visual field land on temporal retina. Those ones don't decassette. Why don't they decassette? See, this is right eye. This ray is coming from the left visual field. A ray from the left visual field landing on the right eye. We consider that that one has already decassetted because it's from the left field. It has landed on the right eye. So that one does not need to decassette again. That's why it goes on the same side. But look at this ray. This ray is from the right visual field. It has landed on the right eye, so it has not yet decassetted. This one will have to decassette. Same as that side, whichever eye you use, it's the same concept. This is from the left visual field. It has landed on the left eye, so no decassation yet, so that one has to decassette. But this one is from the right visual field. It has landed on the left eye. This one has already decassetted, so it does not need to decassette. So that from the optic tract, from the optic chiasma, the fibers which come out, they are still second order neurons because there's no synapsing of the chiasma. So they're still second order neurons. Those second order neurons are now called the optic tract. So this is the optic tract. But what do you notice about optic tract? An optic tract carries information from the contralateral visual field. As you can see the blue here, I'm hoping this is okay. I might be beaten for calling it blue. But the one that's not red. So these ones here. These ones are coming from the right visual field. They're now on the left side. The red ones are on the right side, but they're coming from the left visual field. The optic tracts contain information from the whole of the opposite visual field. Remember, they are second order sensory neurons, so they have to terminate within the thalamus. And they do terminate in the thalamus. There's a specific nucleus within the thalamus that the optic tract fibers synapse in. That nucleus is called the lateral geniculate body. You can also call the lateral geniculate nucleus. You may forget that one, not a big deal. Just know it's within the thalamus. So second order neurons for vision terminate in the thalamus just like any other sensation. From the thalamus, we have third order sensory neurons for vision, which come from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Those neurons constitute what we call the optic radiation. So this is optic radiation. From the optic radiation, the neurons will terminate in the cerebral cortex. The specific region of the cerebral cortex where the neurons terminate is what we call the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex being located in the occipital cortex, occipital lobe. Area number 17. Great, so that is the visual pathway. I want to give you another 10 minutes break. When we come back, I'm going to pick from this one, and I'll be asking you some questions. And so I want you to think through within those 10 minutes so that when we come back, it's easier. Having talked about the visual pathway, the way we've done it, when we come back, I'll ask you, so if you have injury here, what will we lose? If you have injury here, what will we lose? So I'll be picking a number of regions, and I ask you if it's injured, and let's say just cut off. So if you cut here, what will the person not be able to see? And we talk about loss of vision based on the region of the visual field that the individual is not able to see. So think through. When we come back, we'll be discussing that. 10 minutes break. It is now 10. Okay. It is 9:58. We can assume it's 10. So let's meet at 10 minutes past 10. Again, if you have questions, just feel free to put on the chat. So we had reached here. And we've said that vision is perceived in the primary visual cortex, which is the occipital lobe. We've looked at this pathway. So I told you that I'm going to ask you a few questions. Let's start with here. If I injure here, and this is the left optic nerve, if I just cut here, it means you're going to lose vision. Loss of vision is what we call anopia. So the question is, what is projected to you here? If I injure the left optic nerve, where will I lose vision? Will I lose vision in the left eye? Will I lose vision in the right eye? Will I lose vision in both eyes, or I will not lose vision? I want you to answer that in the chat. So you just write whether A, B, C, or D. So the level of injury here is optic nerve. We are injuring the left optic nerve. So quickly, only 3 people have responded. The others, please do haraka. Fair enough. So majority of you have responded. Now, in as much as majority of you have responded, many of you have failed it. But I'm happy that there are a number that have still gotten it. So if I injure the left optic nerve, it means that information from the left eye cannot go to the brain. Therefore, the left eye will be totally blind. Now see this second one. I want to have an injury at the optic chiasma this way. Look at it. Something that is cutting the optic chiasma in this manner. If I injure the optic chiasma in that manner, vertically like that, what will be the answer? So this is now injury at the optic chiasma. Again, I want you to just write in the chat the way you've written. You choose A, B, C, or D. You have 30 seconds. You're injuring it this way, vertically this way. Or that's sagittally. Okay, most of you have gotten it. Actually, only 2 people have failed it. So if you injure like this, you are affecting the neurons which come from both eyes. So both eyes will be affected. Now, while you're still there, I want to ask a question that I want you to unmute, then respond. If you have injury to the optic chiasma in the manner that you've described, we've agreed that both eyes will be affected. My question to you is, which part of the visual field will the person not be able to see? Which parts of the visual field will this individual not be able to see? You see, in this one, in the first one, if you have injury at the optic nerve, you lose vision from that whole eye. That is total anopia of the ipsilateral eye. Ipsilateral means the same side. If you have injury, sagittal lesion of the optic chiasma like this, I'll affect both eyes. So my question is, which part of the visual fields will we not be able to see? Anyone? You can just unmute yourself and respond.
The temporal part.
Temporal visual field.
The temporal visual fields. Good. So you'll not be able to see the temporal visual fields for both sides. And so that is what we call bitemporal hemianopia. If you have injury to the optic chiasma this way, you get what we call bitemporal hemianopia. You are not seeing temporal visual fields for both sides. And you understand it's because you are affecting the nasal retina. The information from the nasal retina, which carry information from the temporal visual fields. Okay, good. Now, third question, which you are responding on the chart, is injury at this level here. If I injure the optic tract, am I affecting? So let's just injure the left optic tract. Will we affect the left eye, the right eye, both eyes, or none of the eyes? You are answering that in the chat as well. Let me write it for you first. So we are injuring the left optic tract. Okay, you can now respond. In the chat. You don't need to write the answer. You just write A, B, C, or D. Okay, I believe all of you have responded, or those who wish to respond have done that. So this one is a tie. Majority of you saying right eye. A good number saying left eye, and both eyes, none for D. Okay, let's see. So the neurons in the left optic tract come from both the left eye, as well as the right eye, which means if you injure the optic tract, you'll affect both eyes. Okay, now this one, I want you to unmute yourself, then respond. So how are the two eyes affected? You see, if you injure the optic chiasma sagittally, you lose vision from both temporal fields, and we call that bitemporal hemianopia. If you injure the optic tract, which visual fields are we affecting? So here we are injuring the left optic tract. Which visual fields are we affecting?
The right visual field and the left visual field. Right visual field from the left eye and the right and left visual field from the right eye.
Okay, I'd want you to look at that again.
The right temporal and the left nasal.
Right temporal.
Oh yeah.
Right temporal and left nasal. Okay,
Nasal, yes.
good. So if you affect right temporal and left nasal, in one word, what have we lost? Maybe you've not understood me. If you affect the left optic tract, you're affecting the left nasal and the right temporal. Left nasal and right temporal is the right visual field. If you affect the left optic tract, you lose the whole of the right visual field. If you affect the right optic tract, you will lose the whole of the left visual field. Injury to optic tract makes you lose vision of the whole of the opposite visual field. So the manifestation is contralateral. For the visual field, not for the eye. For the eye, it's both eyes, but for the visual field, it's contralateral. When you lose the whole of the visual field, we call it homonymous hemianopia. If you're losing the opposite visual field, then you can just call it contralateral homonymous hemianopia. Great. I'd want you to then work out other lesions. There are multiple areas that you can check, and in any book you'll find this. So in these images, there are like 7 points that can be lost with different clinical manifestations. I've only picked number 1, number 2, and number 4 for you, but you can check the others later. Okay, let's talk about the extraocular muscles. Extraocular muscles are muscles outside the eyeball, but they move the eyeball or they move the eyelid, as opposed to intraocular muscles, which are muscles within the eye. We have 7 extraocular muscles. 6 of them move the eye, and 1 of them move the upper eyelid. Out of these 6 that move the eye, 4 of them run straight, and so we call them the rectus muscles. We have the lateral rectus muscle, the medial rectus muscle, inferior rectus muscle, and superior rectus muscle. As you can see, they run straight and they are attached to the sclera and they originate posteriorly. So let's think. If the medial rectus contracts, the pupil will move that way, and that means adduction. The pupil will go inwards. That is adduction. So medial rectus adducts the eye. And that means that lateral rectus will abduct the eye. It will make the pupil to go outward. Superior rectus elevates the eye. It makes the pupil to face up like this. Inferior rectus depresses the eye. It makes the pupil to go down like this. So medial rectus adducts, lateral rectus abducts, superior rectus elevates, and inferior rectus depresses the eye. Those are recti muscles. Then you have 2 oblique muscles, the superior oblique and the inferior oblique. Okay, see. The superior oblique comes from around the same place that the recti come from. It runs like this, but has a turn, a hook, like a pulley, that makes it turn its course so that it approaches the eye obliquely that way. This superior oblique attaches on the posterior part of the sclera. So 2 things that I want you to remember about the actions of superior oblique on the eye. You see, if it's attaching on the posterior aspects of the eye, then it means that it will be pulling the posterior parts. If this muscle contracts this way, this one will pull that way. So the superior oblique will be pulling the posterior aspect of the globe medially. But if you assume that the axis of rotation is somewhere here, it means that if you pull the posterior part of the globe medially, the pupil will go laterally. So the superior oblique also abduct the eye, just like lateral rectus abducts the eye. But importantly also, you see it's pulling the upper part forwards. If it pulls the upper part forwards, and let's say this person was already facing medially, this pupil was already adducted, and superior oblique pulls forwards, it will make the pupil to go down. So superior oblique also depress the eye. I want you to remember that superior oblique abducts the eye. It also depresses the eye. How about the inferior oblique? Inferior oblique inserts also posteriorly behind the vertical axis of the eye. That means that inferior oblique, if it contracts, will also pull the posterior part of the eye medially, and that means the anterior part will go laterally, like a steering wheel of a car. When the upper part goes to the left, to the right, the lower part will go to the opposite direction, like steering wheel of a car. So inferior oblique also abduct, just like superior oblique and lateral rectus. But in contrast to superior oblique, the inferior oblique will pull the lower part of the eye forwards, which means the pupil will go up. And that applies to an eye that's already adducted. So inferior oblique elevates the eye, just like the superior rectus elevates the eye. Superior oblique depresses the eye the same way the inferior rectus will depress the eye. Those are the oblique muscles. The seventh muscle is called levator palpebral superioris. As the name suggests, it elevates the upper eyelid. So this is the muscle that makes the upper eyelid to open your eye. In terms of their nerve supply, I like this formula. I say LR6 SO4, then bracket 3. What does it mean? Lateral rectus, which is this muscle here. Lateral rectus is innervated by the 6th cranial nerve, which is the abducens nerve. Then, so that is lateral rectus, abducens nerve. Open the bracket. Within the bracket, we have SO4. So SO here stands for superior oblique, which is this muscle. Superior oblique muscle is innervated by the 4th cranial nerve, which is the trochlear nerve. And lastly, after closing the bracket, we have 3 there. 3 represents the oculomotor nerve. All the other muscles remaining, and remember there are 5 now, all the other muscles remaining are innervated by the oculomotor nerve. So lateral rectus by the 6th cranial nerve, superior oblique by the 4th cranial nerve, all the rest of the extraocular muscles by the 3rd cranial nerve, which is oculomotor. This is how the extraocular muscles are innervated. I'm taking time to take you through that because I want to ask you some things to do with squinting. And the first squinting is what is projected on that lady there. So just feel free to unmute your mic. I want us to discuss this through as we finish. Maybe you unmute when you want to speak. So in this lady, we are seeing she has a squint. Is a squint on her left eye or on her right eye? Anyone?
Right.
Okay, right eye. Good. Good.
Right.
So this is the question now I'm asking you. Which cranial nerve do you think has been injured so that we can have such a squint? Is it the optic nerve, trochlear nerve, abducens nerve, ophthalmic nerve, or oculomotor nerve? Anyone? Just unmute your mic, give a response, and support the response. Here, I want to hear more of the supporting the response. Nobody wants to attempt? We go to the next.
Can I try?
Yes, Mariam.
I'm not too sure, but could it be the oculomotor nerve?
Okay, why do you think oculomotor nerve? I am more interested in the reasons actually.
Because we said that the medial rectus is the one that adducts the eye, and that looks like adduction. And because the medial rectus wasn't represented by the formula, the rest of the extraocular muscles were inhibited by the oculomotor nerves.
Okay, so Mariam, I like what you've said that the right eye is adducted.
Yeah.
That's true. So the squinting here is making the right eye to be adducted. So maybe the part that you've missed is that for the eye to be adducted, it means you've lost something. What have we lost so that the eye can be adducted? Mariam, back to you.
What have we lost?
Yes, which movement has this eye lost so that it can now be adducted? Okay, we can ask anyone.
Sure.
Abduction.
Yes, thank you, Rosemary. So for the eye to be adducted, it means you've lost abduction. And so if you want to get nerve injury, first you have to know which movement has been lost. Then you think through which muscle causes that movement. Then you think through which nerve supplies that muscle. So here we've lost abduction. There are three muscles that cause abduction: the lateral rectus, the superior oblique, and the inferior oblique. So potentially, all of them could be affected. However, if you affect the obliques, you'll not just lose abduction only. You lose abduction plus something else, either elevation or depression, depending on which oblique you've affected. This eye, we've not lost adduction, we've not lost elevation or depression. We can see that both eyes are on the same horizontal axis. So in this eye, we've lost the function of lateral rectus. So then we ask ourselves, which nerve could that be? So what would be the correct answer to this question? Anyone?
Abducens.
Abducens nerve. So this is how abducens nerve injury will look like. Let's try another one. So in this child, I hope you can all notice that again, we are talking about the right eye. So let's first agree on the movements which have been lost in this eye. Which movements has this right eye lost?
Elevation.
Abduction and
Okay, Rosmarian, what are you saying?
abduction and depression.
Yes, I agree with you. It has lost abduction and depression. And I hope all of you are seeing that. You see, the eye is elevated because you've lost depression. The eye is adducted because you've lost abduction. So then you ask yourself, which single muscle does that? Which muscle that be? Anyone?
Superior oblique.
Superior oblique. So this is what we get if you injure the superior oblique muscle. This is a type of squint you get if you injure the superior oblique muscle. And the question is, so which nerve would that be?
Trochlear.
Trochlear.
Good. So this is fourth nerve palsy. So the last one is oculomotor nerve palsy. And this is oculomotor nerve palsy. Maybe you're not seeing it nicely, but again, still on the right eye. The eye is abducted in this case. We have lost adduction. And we've lost adduction because we've lost the function of medial rectus. So the eye is abducted. Let me ask you, what is causing the eye to be abducted? Which muscle is pulling the eye for abduction?
The lateral rectus.
Yes, it's because of the unopposed action of lateral rectus, perhaps also because of the unopposed action of the superior oblique. So this is what you get in oculomotor nerve injury. However, when you're talking about oculomotor nerve injury, there's much more to say. This is how your patient will actually present. First of all, the eye will be abducted because of the action of the lateral rectus. The eye will also be slightly depressed because of the action of the superior oblique. But importantly also, the upper eyelid will be dropping. The dropping of the upper eyelid is called ptosis because you've lost the action of levator palpebral superioris. And fourthly, when you look at the size of the pupil, in oculomotor nerve injury, the pupil is dilated. Why? Because we said oculomotor nerve supplies the constrictor papillae muscle. Constrictor papillae muscle causes constriction of the pupil. So if the oculomotor is injured, then that pupil cannot respond to parasympathetic signals via the oculomotor nerve. So by default, that eye rides on a sympathetic tone, which causes it to dilate. In oculomotor nerve injury, we have four things. The eye is abducted, depressed, the pupil is dilated, and the patient has ptosis. Good, so those are the nerve pulses that I wanted to know. Let's finish with the lacrimal apparatus. So the lacrimal apparatus refers to the path of the tears. Tears is produced by the lacrimal gland. The lacrimal gland occupies the upper outer quadrant of the orbit. The upper outer quadrant of the orbit. From there, the lacrimal gland produces tears, which go to ducts, some small ducts, which we call them lacrimal ducts. Then from these lacrimal ducts, the tears is now spread onto the eye. The film of tears in the eye is what we call the tear film. And of course, due to gravity, the fluid then accumulates down here. So there'll be a pool of tears down here, and you're not necessarily crying that time. The pool of tears down here because of gravity is what we are calling the lacrimal lake. From the lacrimal lake, the tears now drain via two openings near the medial canthus. We call them the lacrimal puncta. We have the superior and the inferior lacrimal puncta. This one largely drain the tears when you are lying in one side, and this one largely drain the tears when you're vertical, but all of them potentially drain. From the lacrimal puncta, tears go to those channels. So this is the superior lacrimal canaliculum, and this is the inferior lacrimal canaliculus. They're just small channels. Then that tear go to this region, this dilated region, which we call the lacrimal sac. From the lacrimal sac, there's a connection that takes tears to the nose. And that is what we call the nasolacrimal duct, from the lacrimal sac to the nose, nasolacrimal duct. It explains to you why, when you're crying, you feel something coming out through your nose again, and you think it's mucus. It's actually tears. Well, usually it mixes with mucus in the nose, and that's why now you'll be producing a lot of mucus when you're crying, because the tears pass through that channel. Great. Within the nasal cavity, it will open into a specific region of the nasal cavity that we call the inferior nasal meatus. We'll talk about nasal meatus largely next trimester when you look at the respiratory system. Right, so that marks the end of what I wanted to take you through in this particular trimester. And it also marks the end of, okay, maybe I said that in a different way. It marks the end of what I want to teach you today. It also marks the end of the lectures that we're having this particular trimester.